Franz von Kearney, writings by Frank Schmidt on the Danube Swabian people. These collected writings are republished in memory of the author, Frank Schmidt, so that others may continue to enjoy his work. May his spirit live on. Hennemann's deed. Although Jakob Henneman, 1744 to 1798, was a civilian, he is the greatest Danube Swabian war hero. In 1788, he successfully defended his hometown of Werschetz with 75 men against a well-armed Turkish force of 60,000, a proud chapter in the annals of the Danube Swabian people. The fair land of Banat was once a tranquil and relatively prosperous homeland for generations of Danube, Swabians of Danube, Swabians. Before its partition between Romania and Yugoslavia, it was for centuries a political as well as geographical entity of Austria-Hungary. After 150 years of Turkish occupation, it was once again incorporated into Hungary in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Imperial Council in Vienna ordered our German ancestors to settle the depopulated wastelands of Banat, which was under the jurisdiction of the army, by offering them substantial material and social benefits. They built 1,000 unique agricultural villages, founded market towns, where none had existed before, introduced Western agricultural villages, founded market towns where none had existed before, and introduced Western agricultural practices to the region. For a couple of generations, they had to endure many hardships, not the least of which were sporadic Turkish raids along the border areas in which most of the German settlements were plundered and torched. The unlucky, defenseless inhabitants who had not fled were often murdered. In order to forestall further breaches of the peace, a military frontier was established, which consisted of a series of watchtowers manned by regular soldiers and armed soldier farmers who could be mustered when the need arose. In 1780, France was at war with Austria, and troops had to be transferred to defend Austrian possessions in the west. The Turks took advantage of the situation and sent an army of 60,000 men across the Danube, which easily overran undermanned defenses and fanned out across southern Banat. When Field Marshal Franz Moritz von Lacy, the Austrian military commander of Banat, learned that the enemy outnumbered his troops by 10 to 1, he was convinced that the military situation was hopeless. Without testing Turkish strength in the battle, he overreacted by pulling out of southern Banat. To deny the invaders winter quarters, he ordered all the houses to be burned to the ground. As the troops retreated to Temesburg, the capital of Banat, not Timisoara, Romania, they saw dense smoke from burning buildings filling the sky. Everywhere except in Werschetz. It did not go up in flames because an even-tempered German citizen farmer named Johann Jakob Hennermann defied Lacy's order to destroy his home and flee. What's more, he urged others to remain and help prevent their hometown from falling into Turkish hands. One should not run from trouble, he reasoned. And if a man is going to make a stand somewhere, why not in his birthplace, defending his home and earth? Before Werschetz became totally isolated, Emperor Joseph II, in Vienna, heard that a commoner had defied an order from his field marshal. He was incensed. Things like that weren't done in those days, nor were they likely to be tolerated even today. However, when the emperor heard the whole story, that Henneman was a loyal subject and wished only to hold Werschetz until it could be relieved by the regular army, he relented and immediately sent a message to the armory in Banat to equip the would-be defenders with an additional 150 muskets, 9,000 rounds of ammunition, and for good measure, a cannon used for ceremonial purposes. Not an overly generous gift, but the emperor, like practically everyone else, believed that it was only a matter of time before the Werschetz would fall to the enemy. After everyone had departed, the 70 Germans and 5 Serbs elected Henneman as their leader. He immediately set them to work building barricades. In feverish, non-stop activity, they hauled heavy timber, earth, and debris to block off all accessible streets. The barricades were so high that they reached the rooftops of adjacent houses. The massive outer walls of Danube Swabian houses were usually 60 km, 2 feet, thick, and did not need additional reinforcing. These non-inflammable walls were thought to be an effective barrier against enemy weapons, and the men felt secure in their new fort. In the ominous silence before the storm, the men had little time to take stock of their situation and for some sober reflection. On the minus side, there were only 75 of them, and their ammunition would not be sufficient for a long siege. None were trained soldiers, but some were excellent marksmen. On the other hand, larders in most houses were filled to capacity, and there was more than enough fuel to last them through the winter. They had plenty of warm clothing. Water was readily available. In short, they were adequately supplied with the necessities of life. Werschetz was a wine town, so there was no shortage of empty wine barrels, nor a full one for that matter. The empty ones were rolled into the streets where they would play an important role in a great ruse. Firewood was placed at every intersection. In time, it too would play a part in the defense of the town. In September of 1788, Werschetz was effectively sealed off from Turkish eyes and from the rest of the world. With utmost confidence, the men waited for their unwanted guest. They didn't have long to wait. As Hennerman watched from his observation post in the steeple of the Catholic Church, about 800 Turkish troops, along with a camel supply train, set up camp in the meadow of Alabunar, just south of Werschetz. Whenever Turkish scouting parties came close, Henneman would unleash his well-planned weapon deception. His men banged on empty wine barrels, hammered on anvils, sounded bugles, beat drums, and shouted commands. To feign full occupancy, smoke rose from the chimney of every house. Every trick the men could think of was used to mislead the Turks into believing they were up against a strong, well-armed garrison. Apparently, the ruse worked because for weeks there was no serious attempt to take the town. Still, Werschetz was the most formidable roadblock on the Turkish invasion route and had to be removed sooner rather than later. It could easily have been bypassed, but the Turks were led to believe the town contained a trap set to spring as soon as their army had advanced beyond it. They've been trapped between two enemy forces before, and we're not going to risk it again. After assembling 15,000 of their finest men, the Turks tried to take the town. The first probing thrusts were easily repulsed by the defenders. Even after doubling the number of troops, the Turks were unable to make a breakthrough, when practically the entire Turkish army of 60,000 men encamped in the vicinity of Werschetz. They were ready for their final attempt to take the town. Meanwhile, Henneman kept a keen eye on Turkish troop movements. Although he was not a military man-3, he had the uncanny ability to analyze the enemy's order of battle and to anticipate their movements. This enabled him to prepare the most effective countermeasures. He was certain that the Turks were going to attempt a breakthrough at the southern barricade, exactly where he thought they would be, and where he had prepared the strongest defenses. Calmly, he directed his men to take up positions on the ramparts. From concealed positions, the men had an unobstructed view of the approach and had a clear field of fire across the open plain. Even if they were outnumbered by 400 to 1, they would be no pushover for the assailants. An advanced party of Turks sent to draw fire to determine the position of the defenders was met with such a hail of well-directed musketry that they retreated without having accomplished their mission. The Turkish cavalry tried to rush the barricade but was dispersed by cannon fire. The panic-stricken horses bolted and their riders were helpless without them. The infantry that followed suffered many casualties from grape shot fired by the cannon. When the defenders ran out of cannonballs and grape shot, they fired their nails and broke glass. Although this innovative ammunition is not usually fatal, it still caused an untold number of enemy wounded to leave the battlefield. The barricades and the massive walls of Danube Swabian houses had easily absorbed Turkish musket balls. Fortunately for the defenders, for some unknown reason, the Turks did not use artillery. That oversight and the sustained determination of the defenders eventually wore down the Turks, who called off the attack to return and fight another day. After failing to overcome defenders during the day, the Turks tried a new tactic, a nighttime assault. They had expected to surprise the defenders by making a quick dash to the barricade under cover of darkness. Unfortunately for them, they had chosen the wrong night. Their troops had crossed an open plain, which was flooded by bright moonlight. And it was the Turks who were surprised. The Sultan's bewildered troops, most of whom had been pressed into military service against their will, had no stomach for nocturnal combat, especially when fighting invisible infidels who, judging by the casualties they inflicted, could apparently see at night. This seemingly unnatural situation caused many Turkish soldiers to throw away their arms and flee the battlefield. The attack, which began with such high hopes, petered out in the early hours of the morning. Clearly, the doughty defenders had won another round. At dawn's early light, it was all quiet. Turkish equipment littered the plain, but there were no soldiers in sight. Even their encampment on a nearby heath was gone. With no immediate danger in sight, Henneman assembled his men and called the roll. Every man was present and accounted for. Not even one man had been lost in the sharp engagement, although some nursed superficial wounds. Outside the occasional catnap, the men had not slept for days. Reset would soon restore their energy, but not their ammunition, practically all of which had been expended. It was obvious that they would be unable to survive another action. The siege had reached a crisis point. The next day, an eerie silence pervaded the area, and there was no activity as far as the eye could see. Henneman suspected that the Turks were up to something, but what? To find out, he sent 3 Serbs who spoke Turkish on a scouting mission, the Jovanovic brothers and a man named Arnautovics. When they did not return by late afternoon, Henneman became concerned for their safety. As he stood in the twilight, gazing into the distance, he saw a flare rising from behind a clump of bushes, a signal from his men that they were in mortal danger. Hastily saddling up their horses, Henneman and a few of his men raced to the scene and surprised the Turks by torturing the Serbs in order to make them reveal the strength of the fort. The Jovanovic brothers were bound hand and foot, forced to watch one Turk drive wood splinters under Arnautovic's fingernails, while 2 others were busy cutting belts out of the man's skin. Infuriated by these inhuman acts, Henneman lashed at the torturers with his sword till they fell to the ground. The others fled as fast as their horses could carry them. With his lifeblood oozing out of his mouth, Arnautovic informed his chief that he had betrayed nothing. With his last breath, he thanked Henneman for saving him and his fellow. Then he sank into Henneman's arms and died. The group sadly returned to town, carrying the body of Arnautovic, their first and, as it turned out, their only casualty. Almost 6 weeks had gone by, and there was no relief in sight. How long could a miracle last? Henneman took up his position on the church's steeple. By habit, his gaze focused in a southerly direction. Thank God, he mused, nothing is happening. Just as his spirits were at their lowest ebb, he turned his head in the opposite direction. Were his eyes playing tricks, or was that really an Austrian cavalry unit cantering towards Werschetz, their lances glinting in the afternoon sunlight? There appeared to be an infantryman with a horse-drawn supply train following them. He waited till he was sure that it was the Austrian army coming to the rescue. Hardly able to contain himself, he shouted from the church steeple in his Danube Swabian dialect, "Unsri kumi." Just in case he wasn't heard, he shouted even louder, "Unsri sin du." Hours are coming, hours are coming, hours are here. When his men heard this, they jumped with joy because deliverance had come just in the nick of time. Although verbal contact was established with the newly arrived troops, and some were led into town, the barricades were left intact for the time being. Since it was late in the day before all the Austrian-German troops had arrived, they set up camp in the meadow to rest and to prepare for whatever tomorrow would bring. At night, the scattered campfires of friendly troops were a comforting sight to Hennemann's men. Finally relieved of their endless guard duty, they had their first uninterrupted sleep in weeks. A bugle-sounding reveille awakened Henneman early the next morning. Out of habit, he went to his lookout to see what was going on in the perimeter of the town. This time, there was no enemy in sight. Instead, on the plain below, he witnessed a display of military splendor, which sent chills up his spine and brought tears to his eyes. Responding to the staccato bugle blast units of the Austrian-German Imperial Army were hastily forming up in the battle order for anticipated battle with the Turks. There was the cavalry, their horses chomping at the bit and pawing at the ground with their hooves roaring to go. And yes, the famous infantry units, which had once been billeted in Werschetz and had been ordered to leave by Lacy, were back. The regiments Langlois, Lattermanstein, and Kallenberg. How resplendent they looked in their colorful uniforms with rows of bright buttons. As battle flags fluttered in the wind and the roll of drums rose and fell, officers with drawn swords rode up and down the lines and made short inflammatory speeches to condition the men for the upcoming battle. When all was ready, the men awaited the order to advance. It was never a given. In those days, armies first sized each other up before engaging in combat. Scouts reported that the Turks had packed up and left the territory. When the men heard this, they were jubilant. They flung their tricorn hats in the air, broke ranks, and shouted "Vivat Vivat," with plenty of willing hands. Offering their services, it didn't take long to dismantle the barricades. Since nothing important was ever undertaken by the Austrian army without music of fife and drum corps, led the way as soldiers marched into Werschetz. They were welcomed by the relieved defenders. Henneman checked his almanac. It was Sunday, October 18th, 1788, 6 long weeks after the siege was finally over. The town suffered little damage, and its citizens, unlike many other refugees, were able to return to their homes. Werschetz's siege is often referred to by historians as Henneman's deed. His deed is credited not only with stopping the Turkish advance into the Banat, but also with saving his hometown and the whole of northern Banat from destruction. He saved the lives of an estimated 10,000 colonists. If you are a Danube Swabian whose ancestors hail from southern Banat, there is a good chance that they would have been among those saved by Henneman. And were it not for his deed, you wouldn't be reading this today. What did the heroic men get from their 6-week ordeal? Not very much, really. When the county administration got around to it, the men were all granted a lifetime exemption from the poll tax of 1 florin 10 crowns. I'll let you figure out the current value. Michael Corman, who had been second in command, and some others were decorated with medals of valor. Emperor Joseph II promised special recognition to Henneman, but he died before this was done. He was succeeded by his brother Leopold II. With ongoing wars, the threat of revolution and court intrigues, Leopold didn't have time to honor some commoner in the fairway Banat. His reign only lasted 2 years when he too died. On November 16, 1792, Henneman also died and was buried at the foot of his beloved vineyard without having been granted any official honors in his lifetime. Soon after Henneman's untimely demise, yet another Emperor Franz I occupied the throne. When reminded of the crown's obligation to the defender of Werschetz, he immediately took steps to settle the matter. A special gold medal commemorating the siege of Werschetz was struck. Henneman was posthumously awarded at a ceremony in Temesburg. In the same investiture, his widow, 3 sons, and daughter were elevated into minor nobility. The oldest son was also granted perpetual use of 80 yokes, acres, of good farmland in the German tract. And that was the extent of the crown's special recognition of Henneman's deed. Another 100 years passed before the town council of Werschetz decided to honor the town's most outstanding son. In a burst of admiration, they named a street after him. It was not a main thoroughfare, mind you, but an ordinary side street. In death as in life, Henneman always seems to have been shortchanged. By the 1940s, Werschetz had become a thriving city of close to 24,000 inhabitants. The majority were Danube Swabians, descendants of the original settlers. A movement sprang up among them to rename their native city to reflect its historical significance. They chose the proud name of Hennemannstadt, Hennemantown. Although this designation was favored in German-speaking circles, it was never officially accepted by other ethnic groups, and therefore not officially adopted. Today, the once flourishing German community of Werschetz no longer exists. It was destroyed during and in the aftermath of World War II. Along with other Danube Swabian communities, it suffered a bitter fate at the hands of Tito's murderers, namely dispossession, slave labor massacres, and from many death by denial of medical aid housing and imposed starvation in Yugoslavia's infamous post-war death camps. Despite lingering resentment of past horrors, some inquisitive Danube Swabian survivors have been drawn back to take one more look at their birthplace. They found that the city now known as Werschetz could no longer be regarded as home. It is inhabited by alien people who are not unduly concerned with its upkeep. Reminders of its German past have largely been eradicated. Yet miraculously, a colorful fresco depicting Hennemann's deed together with its German text are still intact on the walls of the Catholic Church. For returnees, it is a poignant reminder of a glorious page in their history and a way of life that is no more. Had he been born at any other time, to any other group, Johann Jakob Henneman may have been a household name and every schoolchild would know of his heroic deed. I hope we are not yet such an ignoble breed that we fail to find inspiration in Hennemann's deed. We truly appreciate your time spent listening to this captivating episode delving into the history of the Donauschwaben. On the Franz von Körne YouTube channel, our content is richly inspired by the insightful writings of Frank Schmidt, unraveling the fascinating narrative of the Danube Swabians. If this episode resonated with you, we kindly invite you to show your support by liking, subscribing, and sharing it with your fellow Donauschwaben relatives, friends, and social clubs. Anyone with an interest in the captivating history of the Danube Swabians. These little things really do help a new channel out. If you're interested in more information on the Donauschwaben or this episode, explore the show notes below for links and related material. Once again, we extend our heartfelt gratitude for tuning in. Until next time.
Wir sind Donauschwaben, Kindeskinder.